complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about that blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for hosting me, my friend. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. So let's launch into this, because specifically this is a topic that, you know, I think is a pretty big one. Obviously, so much so that you've kind of started at least to write a book about that. And that's what I want to talk with you about human rights. So if you could you kind of introduce, I guess, like the topic of human rights as almost this kind of like prime theological goal of, you know, the civilization we live in.
I mean, it's an immensely complicated topic, but if the question before us is what are human rights, or what does the regime mean by human rights, we're talking about what essentially replaced natural law concepts, which essentially is Aristotle through the lens of Aquinas. You know, that's still to this day underlies a lot of Catholic social teaching. You know, you'll notice that especially court language, but even you know, sociologists and kind of like social philosophers, if we can even dignify them by calling them that, people like John Rawls and Dworkin, Ronald Dworkin, not the crazy feminist lady, whatever her name was. Her name was Dworkin, not Andrea Dworkin, Ronald Dworkin. You know, notice that a lot of their language, it seems to mirror, you know, like Catholic social teaching and like Thomist language, like, and that's not some kind of accident. It's not just because these people were relying upon, you know, the lingua franca of, you know, Western philosophy. I mean, that was part of it, but this was very deliberate, okay, to kind of fortify these postulates with the credibility of precedent in some superficial way, okay. But you know, if I mean, obviously, I mean, this is a human rights discussion, not a natural law discussion. But you know, obviously, you know, the basically morality conventionally in the West is viewed as practical reason, okay, and a regime is only as legitimate as far as it complies, you know, with God's law, you know, which interpreted as acts of state or acts of a sovereign, or in, you know, day-to-day terms, or in more kind of like profound terms. You know, that we're evaluating that, you know, through the lens, if you will, of practical reason. Okay. You know, we come to knowledge of right and wrong, you know, through the fact that, you know, man, created in the image of God, you know, is capable of apprehending these things by virtue of his capacity to reason. That's what separates like man from beast. Okay. So if you abolish God from that equation, and if the highest authority, you know, is the state, and not only is the state kind of like the highest authority, and not only does it enjoy, you know, supreme dominion over man and his affairs, but if also it's you know, it's kind of like it's kind of like the arbiter of moral teaching. You know, like how do you replace natural law concepts with something that's entirely secular, yet at the same time, you know, the force to kind of like animate people towards fealty to it. Like, I'm not saying that, you know, I mean, frankly, like a lot of people, like, are not, they lack complexity. They lack the capacity to apprehend truly complex moral postulates. Okay. Like what I'm getting at is kind of like, how do you sell such a program? Well, basically what these people like Bentham came up with, you know, who I think the true progenitors of these things, even though the 20th century, you know, the thinkers I mentioned, as well as people like Marx and Engels, and you know, and Foucault, as well as Marcuse, you know, had their own kind of interpretation that I think is paramount. But what essentially replaced the understanding of man as, you know, the property of God and the progeny of God, quite literally. What replaced that is this idea that like all humans possess a dignity, you know, and that's kind of ambiguously defined, but that deliberately so. It's not just because that's kind of one of these impossible to define floating signifiers, but it's deliberately ambiguous because that advantages the state with the power to kind of, you know, manipulate definitions according to whatever strictures of its own of its own mandates, which is to emphasize. But what underlies essentially like the secular humanist argument, Like whether you're talking about Marxists, whether you're talking about social democrats, whether you're talking about, American liberals who, kind of trace their origins to these radical abolitionist types, who in turn, we're largely, we're largely like refugees, literally from various like millenarian sects and kind of crazy offshoots of Bible Protestantism that, for all practical purposes, kind of like abandoned scripture as the guiding pole star. But like all these people, what they share in common is this idea that like, every man or woman has an intrinsic dignity, and if you abuse that, or if you don't acknowledge that, or if you exploit them for their labor or on grounds of like their sex, or if you avail them to a regime that's discreet and insular in negative terms, from that of the majority population or culture or race, you're doing violence to their dignity. And this isn't some basic way anti-human, because immutable characteristics don't matter because they're just superstructural. Sex doesn't matter, race doesn't matter. All these things are fake or like contrivances, except the dignity of the person. So like if you don't allow like a homosexual to quote get married, which obviously is like in addition to that being an abomination in the eyes of God, like it doesn't make like a logical sense. Okay. But the claim is of the regime, like, oh, well, the reason why marriage is an institution that the government presides over is because, it has to do with, the decisions of the person relating to who they love. And that's inextricably bound up with their dignity as a human. So to say like, homosexual, like let's say sodomy isn't marriage. Well, you're doing violence to the dignity of those people, and you're making them less than human, because again, none of these things matter, like race or like sex or familial ties or culture or sectarian belief or religious confession. None of that matters other than this like basic dignity. So to say, for example, like not create a kind of secular sacrament out of sodomy. You're attacking the dignity of people, and that's the worst thing you can possibly do to somebody, like short of physical violence. Okay, that's like the short answer. There's different regimes emphasize different aspects of this, and I will say this: Marxists very much downplayed the significance of the individual. Like in some ways, they had contempt for the whole idea of individual rights, in the way that the Anglo-American tradition treats such things. They viewed it as kind of like a bourgeois conceit, like literally, a kind of like narcissism of the money classes, in the absence of which itself is like a symptom of alienation, which the bourgeoisie like suffers just as much as the proletariat, even if they're advantaged within that paradigm. But that's but liberals especially, this is like a key like pole star of their entire ideology. Okay, like Marxists talk all the time about the dignity of labor, and of how like membership in a class that's exploited, and entitles somebody to remedial justice that is very much like bound up with like their individual life, but only basically insofar as like they're participating in a historical process and are like a discrete part of this kind of like sociological and historical whole, if that makes any sense. That's why the term cultural Marxism, people should use it sparingly, or not, maybe not. Like they should be qualified. They should use it qualifiedly. It's not just like a stand-in for like any left-wing kind of sensibility or any kind of strange ideology that the regime is kind of touting at the moment. It's very much distinguishable from like the kind of secular humanism that you see in Western Europe. That's basically like the social democrat regime. Okay, it's very different than like the kind of people who like vote for Joe Biden, like the way they think. Okay, I mean, I don't think people like this have any kind of like developed understanding of affairs of history and things at all. But even those who do, they don't really think in those terms. Okay, so that's important. But that's basically, like I said, it's a huge topic, and the origins of liberalism itself is something that we should treat at some point. But it's like a huge topic. And let me conclude before I hand it back to you. the concept of human rights as a legitimizing criteria, like recognition of human rights, or the enforcement of alleged protections that axiomatically humans are entitled to based upon these criteria that constitute human rights. That became a core tenet of the rationalization for American and communist hegemony at Nuremberg. And this fell apart somewhat on grounds of the Cold War, and that's very complicated too. I mean, the problem which it fell apart is not complicated, but they kind of tortured intellectual gymnastics that one found both, in the West and behind the Iron Curtain to like rationalize this regime where, you got these two, like the world's literally divided between these two blocks, both of which are, essentially asserting their dominion over their respective spheres of influence, by direct violence and doing it constantly. And essentially, like, was preserving the peace between them is that both enjoy a capability in common, to annihilate tens of millions of people, and both have declared an intention to literally exterminate the enemy society, if in an event of war, owing to the traversing of key critical like conflict dyads, which in that case, is the inter-German border and arguably the Middle East. But I don't want to turn this into like some kind of geostrategic history of the Cold War kind of tangent. But that, I know, like, I just like threw a lot at you, but that's the best way I can explain it, as to where we are today. Like I said, they were talking about like the origin of like secular humanism itself. That's a more broad conversation, which is something we should take up at some point if you're willing and interested in doing so, and if the listeners would find that useful. But I think we should kind of narrow our scope for purposes of what we're talking about today. All right.
I think you're completely right, because you did give me a lot to chew on there.
Yeah,
and specifically, I do kind of want to examine this idea of human rights as kind of a legitimating factor of a regime, right? Because if you absorb the broad cultural attitude towards this, it's that and it is very much kind of a Whiggish approach to it, where essentially all humans lived in horrible grinding conditions. All the myths that you've heard about, prima nocta, this kind of like horrible system of oppression. And then human rights were invented. And human rights bound the government to respect inherent human dignity. And if these human dignities, which are ever expanding and ever kind of transforming, well, that is where the state gets its legitimacy from. And if it violates those human rights, almost any action is allowed. And you notice this in even
let me just continue real quick. That's why people who self-identify as gay are now like the ideological vanguard of the regime. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, right. It's enabled this whole elaborate patronage network to be a little bit more formalized, right? But in addition to that, you've even seen this language, and this is really where this conversation kind of came from my perspective, is you even see this language in the way that, shall we say, like normal conservatives talk. Yep. Because I was in a conversation with an older person, and the topic of guns and self-defense came up, right? And that conversation was exclusively viewed through the premise of this kind of like 18th century liberal tradition, right? Like, it's our human rights. We have the human right to do this, and if you're looking to restrict that, you're taking away my human rights. And to me, it kind of brought up this question, right? Which is that the dyad we are given, by kind of our cultural overlords, is you can either have human rights, which essentially is whatever the regime wants, or you can live in, Pol Pot's Cambodia. And there's nowhere else between the two of those. And to me, that seems like on its face, clearly absurd. But it wasn't a topic I'd actually, explained. So if you could you kind of go into the nature of authority outside of, a human rights framework? Like, are those the only two alternatives? Just pure oppression and human rights?
No, there's something basically impoverished about the post-Marxist left. I mean, for that reason, because I mean, a point I'm always making to people, I mean, I deal a lot with Marxism, like in a critical capacity, because you want to understand the 20th century, not just in terms of, you know, the philosophical discourse of the 20th century, the kind of conceptual frameworks that were posited in the civilized world, as well as, you know, like war and peace issues, you know, like why the Second World War happened. You've got to deal with Marxism. You know, that's why like Hobsbawm, who was in some ways this crazy Stalinist and not like a guy who anyone should really have nice things to say about. He did have certain insights into reading him provides certain insights into the Marxist mind. And he was one of these guys, the day he died, he lived to be like 93 or something. And he was like an unreconstructed Stalinist, kind of like Egon Krenz was, or like Gus Hall was. You know, like he hated secular humanists and like social democrats. And one of the things that he came back to, it's subtle, but it during the Vietnam era, especially, it kind of became very discernible in his critiques. You know, it basically was positing was like, look, you know, like history is a process. There was like good things and bad things, you know, about like the industrial age, and what emerged subsequent. And like man was gradually liberated from a lot of things, you know, but he was enslaved in other ways, you know, but regardless, it doesn't matter because, you know, all this was part of like an essential process by which, you know, we're approaching telluric utopia. So stop talking about how horrible the past was because it was essential. You know, and that's why in the DDR, for example, too, there were like during there's like the East German army would like lionize certain figures from like the Peasants' War, and guys like Florian Geyer even like saying that like see like this was like a kind of proto-socialist understanding of, you know, the rights of, you know, the pre-industrial laboring caste and stuff. You know, that's also why like the Eastern Bloc like would not abide, you know, the quote unquote Holocaust narrative, you know, because it wasn't just because, you know, they disdained, you know, privileging any one ethno-sectarian narrative over another. It's because they view history like history is their stand-in for God, like quite literally, okay? And Marxism might be absurd. It might be preposterous in terms of its assumptions. You know, it might be a flagrant masquerade, you know, as it presented itself as some kind of science of history, but it is philosophically rigorous, like on its own terms. Okay, liberalism really is not. So it has need to kind of vilify the past in ways that, you know, competing ideologies don't. Because basically it's only claimed legitimacy in practical terms as well as moral ones, but more discernibly in practical terms is basically like the world was unbelievably horrible in every epoch until now, and there's still horrible things afoot that we just need to like iron out. But you know, even if you don't like what's afoot, like it's just categorically superior to everything that came before. That's why like one of the many like moronic things like Churchill said. I believe it's Churchill, and don't say I'm like a dumb, not you, but like I don't people in conversation don't talk about it like I'm a stupid fuck or something. If I'm improperly sourcing this quote, it was Churchill or somebody like him who issued that asinine statement like democracy is the worst form of government ever, but it's better than all the rest. Like first of all, you're a fucking idiot if you say that. And democracy, if we're talking about, you know, such that like Pericles presided over, it was actually an outstanding form of government. Nothing in the 20th century has been remotely democratic. Finally, even if that were true, you're about the least fit man to lead if your notion is I'm gonna implement the least bad option of bad options. I mean, that's the ultimate kind of like loser sensibility. That's like loser ontology. Okay, so that's part of it, but it's also I'll get back to you in a second. Progressivism of the New Deal sort of today. You know, Marxists, obviously, like the East Bloc and people like Khrushchev himself, and Andropov himself, you know, they're completely full of shit when they say like, well, we're approaching socialism and this state apparatus people resent won't exist in 30 years or something. Like they didn't believe that, but that was the narrative. The narrative of progressives and social democrats is the government is wonderful. My God, we could never do without government. government's the only thing that's preventing those Hobbesian wasteland of horrors. And plus, the body politic they're racist and sexist and they murder gay people. So we could never, ever, ever, ever allow government to be dismantled. It's the only thing preventing hell on earth, and it's the only thing guaranteeing the dignity of persons. So, in order to rationalize that, like liberalism is the only regime. Like social democracy / liberalism, capital L. It's the only regime that presents government as like fulfilling this like essential function. Like even arguable like minarchists like John Locke, they talk about how like the night watchman state is still like essential. Even though its dominion is very, very small, and like what it properly like wields authority over. Like nobody really thinks that way. And I know people are going to come back at me and say like, oh, what about like monarchy and monarchists? Monarchy is not government in the way we think about it. It represents something totally different. It has to do with like the management of social relationships and like how people can acquire justice, between the castes where there's very, very little, if no mobility between them. It's like more like a sociological necessity owing to a certain kind of caste structure than it is, like a government in the sense of Franklin Roosevelt, or a government in the sense of, the USSR from 1921 to 1989, or like, the Netherlands and the EU, the Netherlands and the several states against the EU, in like 2023. I mean, it's something very different. Like, yeah, okay, it's a seat of, it was an ultimate seat of sovereignty, like government is today. But that's kind of where and it had like exclusive dominion over the legitimate application of violence between states and war and peace. But that's kind of where the commonality ends. So that's why. Forgive me enough to be scattershot, but the idea of government as a raison d'etre unto itself, in very pragmatic terms, the only way that can be rationalized is to declare that the alternative is hell, and like without it, like we were just lost and living in this like abject misery that with no hope of abatement, like until the emergence of government. Like that's why.
Well, and you see this in two places. So one, I got it very explicitly, when I was in school, because went to business school, and according to your average business school finance professor, before the Federal Reserve, it was complete chaos. It was dogs and cats living together. The world was perpetually just 2 hours away from complete and total collapse. And in another place, in addition from kind of like the more explicit programming on this, you see it in media as well, right? There's this idea, and you notice it a lot in kind of like low quality, kind of like shitty modern horror movies, right? Where there's this trope that if you see a group of, well put together white people, living together as a family, well, behind that, there's something sinister. They're all just one step away from snapping and killing you. And so I have a guilty pleasure. There's a series of movies, and it's a stupid concept, right? It's called The Purge. The idea is, the radical fascist American government has decided to give, one night a year where you can just go out and kill people. And they're really dumb.
And black, like you live in Chicago, yeah.
But the funny thing, and I should say, I've never actually seen the first one. I've only seen the sequels, is that they get less and less subtle with their political messaging over time, to the point where by the end of it, it literally is the world's least subtle anti-Trump, anti-immigration message. But in that, you see kind of a similar thing where multiple times you hear this basically explicitly said to the camera, like, oh, without law, these white ranchers, they'll just round up, these Mexicans, and they'll just start murdering them, without the state. And that's essentially the lesson of the whole series, right? Is that you need us to protect you from what came before. And it's a stupid movie, and that's why I bring it up, because it's kind of a funny anecdote.
No, I'm glad you raised it, because I've got my own kind of like film reference that I want to raise too, because it's timely. But yeah, go ahead.
But nonetheless, you see the same message, in media, in culture, that without us, no one could protect your civil rights. And civil rights kind of means everything and nothing all at once. And the idea is, without us, and this is specifically targeted to what I've been calling kind of new Americans, right? The people who were in many ways brought into the franchise, either through immigration or through civil rights legislation post 64. We'll just say those, new Americans, right?
Yeah, and they very much like don't get America like writ large, aside from everything else. Yeah.
Well, right, but the message is always, you need us or else they'll get you. You're essentially like hanging out over a pit and we're the rope keeping you from falling. And it's kind of like this odd, dark, I guess, undertone to the language of human rights. Is this kind of like keep us around or else message. But anyway, you were bringing something up.
Well, it's like, what's fascinating to me is like a lot of people know who follow my content. Like the original Mad Max is like one of my very favorite movies, and it's like an incredible movie for all kinds of reasons. After Byron Kennedy died, like George Miller like showed himself to be like a typical like fuckhead like liberal, and he made like this god awful Beyond Thunderdome movie. But in 2015, he made another Mad Max movie with Tom Hardy called Fury Road, and it's basically The Handmaid's Tale, but with like Mad Max as a side character. But like all that aside, it shows you how little like bougie liberals understand like human societies. Like long story short, like the plot is that there's this warlord guy, and like World War III happened. Like one of the only remaining pockets of humanity is in Australia, and I mean people know I think the Mad Max like kind of setting. So there's this guy who's like this warlord. He's like a Khan, and he has these like, and obviously like healthy, fertile women are very rare. Okay, but aside from that, like in like polygamy and a great man having many wives is kind of the norm in pre-civilized conditions. But long story short, this guy's wives and like the kind of matron who watches over them, and this lady who's like part of his kind of security apparatus, they decide that this man having many wives, it represents people being treated as property. Their sons will be raised to make war, and this is a violation of their dignity. So the wives run away to the wasteland. Now, anyone who thinks, number one, that like guys' wives, even a guy with many wives who's a powerful Khan, anyone who thinks that like women do anything that like men tell them to do, like has no understanding of like women. Okay, like a woman who you're involved with, particularly your wife, even if she's one of like many wives, she's not doing shit she don't want to do. Okay. Number two, if people think that a woman would rather live in a literal wasteland of anarchy, disease, and starvation than be a rich, powerful guy's wife, because that represents an inequitable property relationship, they're like so like laughably bougie. Like I don't know what to say to that. And it's like one of the reasons why there's like entire memoirs written about there's entire chapters of memoirs written about people who like worked under different presidents, about how like you had to approach Nancy Reagan or Eleanor Roosevelt or Lady Bird Johnson to get anything done because like she's the only one who could like bust the boss's balls and get away with it. So if you got her on your side, you were like good. I mean, this is like basic like man woman stuff, and it's like the idea that being like a Khan's wife is like this horrible state of slavery. It's like so at odds with reality. Like I don't even know like what to say about it. I mean, that's all. Like it's just it's like so on. It's just like this is the way like people who never ever leave their house, and I guess like live in like weird kind of like geography of nowhere suburbs. Like I guess this is the way they think about the world. Like, but that's incredible. Honestly, that's all.
Well, and you see the same thing with, shall we say, just like direct, like martial control, right? It is that just by virtue of the fact that, people lived in much less concentration just due to technology. The vast majority of people lived in an agricultural setting, relatively far away from the center of power. And it's not necessarily that, the rulers in a previous era were good people. They may or they may not have, but there were just certain things they couldn't stop you from doing. There was realistically just no way to do it. There weren't enough people. There wasn't the technology to facilitate it.
Exactly.
And it's this type of kind of like panopticon, where essentially everything you do is monitored. Like that's a fundamentally modern, and I mean that in the, modern as in, 20th century, right? Invention. it was just something that was in many ways enabled by technology. And the idea that before that, people lived again in this, just like grinding slavery, like everything about their lives was just nothing but toil. Again, like that's not a historical contention. That's an ideological one, and when I see it from people who are allegedly kind of like against the Nuremberg regime, against, the social planners, to me, that's just such an own goal. You're accepting their justification for why they're in charge.
Well, what's fascinating, yeah, no, hugely. What's fascinating to me, like I read a lot about Indians, like American Indians. I mean, not like people on the subcontinent. I mean, for a lot of reasons, because they're people with like a fascinating history, particularly the Plains Indians, I think. But if you read it, like Howard Fast, who was a commie, but he wrote some interesting historical literature, kind of like Upton Sinclair did. I think The Jungle's a good book if you can overlook the kind of on the nose, like Workers of the World Unite kind of stuff. Howard Fast was similar. He wrote a book. God damn it. He wrote a book about the Cheyenne Indians, who they were uprooted from their traditional hunting and trapping ground, in an attempt to like resettle them and like make them farmers. Okay, and they resisted this staunchly, and they left the settlement that they were just kind of like deposited on, to go back. To like the Wyoming territory and like live how they'd always lived. And when these people were forced finally to, kind of like practice, situated agriculture, they started dying off. They just died, and nobody could explain why. But it was the people who were forcing this regime. They were a bunch of progressives and like Northeastern liberal types. We're like, oh, this noble savage just needs to be taught to be civilized, and nobody wants to live in the hell on earth of being, a hunter gatherer, a trapper, But it's like it's that conceit that anything other than like the modern bourgeoisie form of life is some kind of hell. That's caused all kinds of abject misery, and it's like that, not traditional ethnic conflict and racism on the frontier that like really, really, really fucked up the Cheyenne. Like I'm not saying people need to like sit here and act like the Cheyenne are this big victim population. I mean, I think they got done pretty dirty by progressives, frankly, and that's not me saying, like white man bad, like like red man's land taken. Like none of obviously, anyone knows me, like knows I don't think in those terms at all. So don't say that shit in the comments, anybody. But the point is, you're trying to force people, whether you're trying to like force like black folks to like act like middle class white people, or whether you're trying to force the Cheyenne Indians, to be a bunch of Methodist farmers, like that's actually a very evil thing to do. Because people's culture and their race is not a superficial thing; it's intrinsic to who they are, both spiritually and biologically. And trying to destroy that, or trying to socially engineer that away, that's an incredibly evil thing, to do to anybody. I mean that's my point. And like that's and what's fascinating, yeah, is that this is like it's a deliberate blind spot of the people who are the more thoughtful among the regime loyal, because it's something they can't explain away. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, you've seen it in kind of the, shall we say, the foreign policy adventures of the last 20, 30 years, right? Where there's this continued desire, especially after, the Cold War, right? When kind of this like external pressure dropped to replicate, quote unquote, American values, across the world. And the idea is that, well, since this is, to go back to that Churchill quote, this is the best of a bad choice, paraphrasing, right? But the idea that, Western style liberal democracy is essentially the pinnacle of political technology. Well, then, we ought to, in kind of this like weird evangelical sense, like we've got to spread it everywhere. We've got to spread the good word of Western liberal democracy. And the idea that is a cultural outgrowth of a certain population is just anathema to these people, right? And I noticed this because, and I've mentioned multiple times, I have a friend who I, on a personal level, like a good bit, but he's kind of a DARPA think tank type, right? He works for, kind of like the NGO sphere.
Right.
And when he speaks about like human rights and democracy, they don't refer to hard political outcomes. It's essentially it's a theological claim. The idea is that, well, this is the correct way for people to be. That we will educate the masses of the world to be like, essentially, like you said, like northeastern liberals. And I think that is the truth that, and I know that you're not a big fan of this guy, but it's the truth that people like Moldbug are kind of getting at when he says that there's a similarity between modern progressives and Puritans, right? That they do essentially have a similar way of viewing the world, where people must be educated into essentially becoming, other Puritans.
All politics is conceptually theological. I mean, yeah, that's true. I think people overstate it, but yeah, there is a linear trajectory, between progressives, particularly those who seem to be in love with the idea of violence to impose their ideology on others under the auspices of liberation. I mean, there's a heritage in common between them and the Puritans of yore, but more broadly, all politics is conceptually theological. Okay, it is, and acts of state, in symbolic psychological terms, take on the characteristics of miraculous occurrences or providential designs. I mean, this is universal. Even people who bandy like loudly and proudly about how atheist they are, they're constantly making theological arguments. Okay, and they're making like bastardized natural law arguments under the auspices of gobbledygook and jargon that kind of masks those characteristics, but that's very, very, very much true. It's not just some rhetorical device invoked by Carl Schmitt to make a point. And he wasn't just talking about the left Hegelians; he was talking about liberals and social democrats, like arguably even more as a standard bearer of that tendency than the communists. But this idea that yeah, and this idea that this idea that social engineering is a moral imperative. I mean, yeah, that's bound up with the theological character and symbolic psychological terms of politics generally, but it's something. It's a peculiar feature that owes to kind of like the New Deal or revolutionary ideology. Like I make the point again and again that one of the reasons why people like Mearsheimer, much as I esteem him and much as he's absolutely right in his strategic analyses, he doesn't really understand the psychological dimension of power politics, and he doesn't really understand, kind of like the epochal nature of these things and zeitgeist. The American ideology, or like liberalism, or like New Dealerism, or like the kind of Anglophone / Zionist worldview, that just like Marxist Leninism, it can't abide like any competitor ideology or it will die. Okay, it's intrinsically bound up with the enterprise of globalism, and that's one of the reasons why the Cold War was so very dangerous, because it was not an ordinary conflict. It wasn't an ordinary conflict even within the boundary rationality of ideological battles. Okay, like that's there's a I really like, it might have been Celine, I can't remember, but it was a guy who was very base in his view of the Second World War, and he said that Stalingrad was where right and left Hegelians met for all time in this apocalyptic battle to settle their differences once and for all. And like that's absolutely correct. And like National Socialism had to prevail at Stalingrad. It just had to. Okay, but otherwise, in the way that it had existed, it would die. Okay, even beyond the fact that, in my opinion, the war was lost already, and by the winter of 1942-43. But like liberalism, it's not something that can, or the American regime or the globalist regime, it's not something that can abide like genuine like political pluralism. Like it can't, because like that cuts against its entire like ontological claims. Because it claims that the things that are literally like the essence of politics, identitarian things that are perennial, that are organic, that are immutable, that these things don't matter, or that they're artificial, or that they need to be done away with. So like a pluralist globalist regime, it would be this kind of like devolved like federalism, where there'd be like a nakedly Islamic parties, there'd be like white nationalist parties, there'd be like Leninist political parties. Like, you can't tolerate that kind of thing, because its entire ontology is premised upon the denial of the friend enemy paradigm, and the fact that it's like the essence of power politics. I'm sorry to be an FAGGOT, but I gotta go take some ibuprofen. I'll be back in 2 minutes. I'm sorry about this.
Yeah, no worries, man.
Okay, hold your thought in rebuttal, or hold whatever you're about to say. Okay, I'll be right back, man.
Yeah, no worries. I can just edit this out.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Okay, I'm sorry about that, man. I'm in a lot of pain today. Like, not to be a murderer, but yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So anyway, if we can get back to this, one of the things that I'm curious is why do you think that the scope of what is considered human rights is kind of continually changing and expanding? Is it just to fit kind of current needs of the regime, or is there some kind of like ideology of expansion?
It's both. And it's also too, when I say that the New Deal ideology, or more properly the Nuremberg regime, which is now in its kind of complete manifestation, we can just call it globalism. Part of the essence of what Schmidt called parliamentary democracy, because his point of reference and his primary critical study was of the European system in the interwar years, and now it very much reflects that too, with some qualifications owing to the fact that Europe is literally occupied, but the American system, nevertheless, different as it is structurally, it holds in common the fact that, one of the things that's insidious about liberalism and what it calls democracy is that it's where the rubber meets the road, it functions by institutionalizing social tensions and continually seeking out clients, and generating grievances, to create demand for its patronage to those like client populations. But also, it's got to be careful in how it establishes patronage. The experience of blacks in the 20th century is actually pretty tragic. I'm not saying that obviously in like a George Floyd and phony ideological ways such that is promoted. I don't think I need to say that, but I guess some people maybe are familiar with what my entire worldview is. It might be required for their benefit, but blacks were very much used and discarded by the regime. And I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but they were very much utilized as an ethnically as a proverbial sword, for interceding battles between elites to ethnically cleanse populations they didn't like, and thus break the back primarily of Catholic political power as well as of the Solid South. But beyond that, stirring up racially based grievances in that way can very much backfire. It's the case of the opponents of Napoleon in the final phase of the Napoleonic Wars, particularly like the British. They stirred up on the Iberian Peninsula. They stirred up all these like Spanish radicals, okay, and they created like the infrastructure for them to revolt against the Napoleonic regime. But then, like, lo and behold, for like 7 decades subsequent, they were like dealing with this problem. That's E. Michael Jones has actually raised that point, and it's a very good one. That's one of the things that underlies the regime, just kind of like deciding that like it's gonna like put blacks on lockdown. Like, it's not doing that because of racism, but like it is doing that. Okay. So I've always made the point that people who self-identify as gay, which is somewhat distinguishable from homosexuality in and of itself. I don't think I'm splitting hairs here, but the reason why the regime has like decided that it's just going to like promote this demographic as kind of like the ideal citizen is because it's people who are shorn of any like meaningful identitarian features, other than that which has literally been like confabulated by the regime. So there's not like a risk of, like that you find, with like stirring up hostility among people on racial or cultural or sectarian lines, which are things that actually exist, and actually do like, have an existence absolutely independent of the regime. That unlike the regime is robust and, historically grounded and all these other things. I think that's why. But also, as the social engineering regime kind of continues and grinds on, like people's public perceptions do change somewhat, and what features more prominently in narratives, and what is kind of like less emphasized, that changes too. But it's also too, people predicted, like Aldous Huxley, like in Brave New World, like everybody's obsessed with sex, but in some like weird banal way, and the government's obsessed with promoting this because people who are like obsessed with like masturbatory sex like don't do anything, and they're just kind of like these useless nihilists. I mean, that's like not accidental too. Okay, I mean, there's a reason why I'm always making the point again and again that when like one of the first things America did when it occupied what became the Bundesrepublik was like start flooding the streets with pornography. And like when the IDF conquered Ramallah in 2002 or whatever. Forgive me if I'm misstating the date, but what they do, they took over the radio station and or occupied Ramallah, not conquered. They started broadcasting hardcore pornography 24 hours a day. Like, is that because like the Israelis wanted to like liberate the Arabs, or is that because like these Morgenthau types like wanted to like help Germans overcome their like sexual hangups? Like, no, that's obviously a weapon, and obviously like sex, just like powerful narcotics or just like anything else, it can be used to like destroy the social fabric of societies that when it's targeted for destruction, or just like screw with people psychologically, and disturb them in some basic sense. So yeah, it's all those things.
Well, and you see
yeah, go ahead.
You see this most clearly in people my age, right? Because if you hear any conversation about the Zoomers, one of the things that comes up over and over again is that Zoomers essentially lack identity. That a lot of the social institutions, a lot of kind of like the pre-made social identities of different cliques have fallen apart. And what we've been kind of left with is people scrambling for these kind of like consumer created civil rights, human right type identities, right? So
Yeah,
this is behind a lot of the like really ridiculous, gender discussion that goes on, on different social media platforms, right? It's like, oh, I must be a pansexual demi boy. There's a flag that goes along that. There's a look that goes along that. There's multiple things that kind of create a default identity in that. And so, many of these people my age because they have been so thoroughly disconnected from, their ethnicity, their creed, their location. They've been so thoroughly deracinated that they're kind of scrambling for anything. And I think that one of the really devious things about this social planning regime is that it blocks off your access to the things that traditionally provided a sense of identity and community to most people, right? It blocks off your access to those, and it replaces them with a whole cornucopia of different options that are really all the same. They're really all pointless, but as a core part of that identity, it ties you to the regime, right? So for instance, right, you saw this specifically, and this isn't a Zoomer thing, but this is a broader cultural thing. And what Biden said, if you vote for Trump, you're not black, right? So okay, well, what does that mean? Obviously, does it literally mean that Biden's going to come around, check who you voted for, and just suck out your melanin? But what it does mean is that part of the identity of being capital B black is being a client of the regime, is being allied to this system. And that's a really easy example of it. But those are the only type of identities that are allowed. The identities that tie you into, what the social planners want for you.
No, exactly. And yeah, and it And to your point, also, these ersatz identities, they don't exist outside of the cultivation and maintenance by the regime. Like it's not they have like no independent existence. So yeah, it's kind of ideal, and that's yeah, man. And that's why that's the point I'm always making about, and it's I mean I include I'm not just trying to show my own work product, but I'm drawing upon it because that's what's familiar to me. The one of the ways people come to terms with death is the fact that like linear natality of the kind that allows cultures to exist. There really is, and this is being I mean, even if you're kind of like a hard line materialist or whatever, and you're not one for religion or anything else, epigenetic memory is a very real thing, and at the biological level, it's just being demonstrated more and more as some of the mysteries intrinsic to the human genome and what in fact is heritable, and what in fact is a heritable trait in psychological terms is kind of more and more revealed. If you destroy people's ability to live historically, like you're not just kind of saddling them with a meaningless life that's devoid of anything that truly constitutes human activity in the way that it's traditionally understood, but you're kind of like cutting off this sort of like perennial consciousness from what sustains it. It's kind of a way. It's a way of like murder writ large, and I'm not trying to be melodramatic. Like I mean that. That truly is a genocidal enterprise beyond anything heretofore conceptualized. And I'm sure people will think that I'm like resorting to mysticism or something. Like I'm not. I mean, yes, I'm a God-fearing man, and yes, I do believe. I do believe very much in metaphysics. Okay, but like what I'm talking about is something the existence of which cannot be denied. Like however much people might disagree on like what the ultimate source of it is, and that's why and on some level, even people who can't conceptualize this in truly developed terms, they instinctively recognize it, and that's why they're like terrified to die. Like frankly, I don't want to die because there's still some things I want to get done, but I'm okay with the fact that's going to happen. And if I found out I had terminal cancer today, I think, like I said before, that would kind of suck, but I'd be okay with it. I mean, I would. I mean, it's not me like trying to talk hard or something. Like being hard has nothing to do with it. But that's the reason why I'm okay with it is because I'm connected to the things that I just described. So yeah, and that's what's also too. There's something it's like out of your hands. It's like I made the point to people before that even if tomorrow, like, I mean, I wouldn't do this. But let's say tomorrow, like, I became this like big atheist. I still think like a dissenter prod. Like that's literally the way like my parents thought, my grandparents thought, my entire lineage thought. Like the way I like structure things in my mind. Whether we're talking about like ethical things or aesthetical things or this is like the way like I think and the way like I quote feel about stuff. Everything from me being kind of like introverted and like uptight about people I don't know like touching me to like the way I contemplate historical occurrences. Kind of like my the kind of like my sort of like gray like view of the world. Like with my kind of traditional like gloomy like Anglo-Teutonic pessimism. Like I can't like escape from these things, even if I like decided like I'm at odds with God or like I'm no longer a Presbyterian. Just like all these people who were like, oh to hell with Catholicism, I'm a recovering Catholic. Like you ask them their views on like any social problems or something, they basically like drop on you like Catholic social teaching, but then like insist they don't believe in God. It's like, yeah, I mean these things like whether you like it or not, you're like connected to, and they like constitute the core of your being. That's it's not a consumer choice.
Well,
like
and that's what makes it so difficult because, like we've said, that this religion of human rights is, I mean, it is a political religion, and because it is the state religion of the society that you and I are both from, admittedly at kind of different stages in degeneration, but still, it's hard to kind of get it out of your head to a certain degree, and it's why I believe it's my friend Charles Haywood who said this. That's like no matter what comes next, it will be post-liberal. And what he meant by that is essentially like we can't get away from how we were raised. And it's difficult because some of that's just inevitable. Some of that's just, that's how it works, when you are from a tradition, whether it's religious or a political one. But there's also something very, like, truly subversive about how much of this programming we've, received through, shall we just say, like, general osmosis, right? And so it's always it's a hard, I guess, situation to find yourself in, that you are kind of continually fighting and maybe it's easier for you, because you've been in these waters a little longer, but it is kind of this continual, I guess, process of, figuring out if, your thoughts or opinions towards something are true or they are just kind of something you came to through, osmosis from people who hate you.
Alex Linder used to make that point, and I know people, that name might mean nothing to you, but like years back, he was an early online, like, right wing polemicist, and he had for them days, he had a pretty substantial following, and he was an interesting guy. He made a lot of enemies. He was kind of a crazy guy, but I always respected his intellect, and you're nothing like him. You're like a smarter guy, and you're like a way, like, just better person. But I'm not like putting shade on you by comparing you to him at all, because he was a very smart dude, and he made that point that he's like, people's like default setting psychologically is like liberalism, and I grew up in a weird place, like, not weird, like, I grew up in like a really awesome place in some ways. Like, I tell people, like, many times, like, I didn't grow up in some hard hood. I grew up in like a super zip, to use Charles Murray's term. Like, I'm not trying to like capture clout in some fucking stupid way. Like, this is literally where I did. And like I said before, I was surrounded by what used to be called, like, lace curtain Irish and like rich immigrant Catholics and like rich Jewish people. And like, I was like this guy who like went to the Presby church the next town over. And like, I was cool with like, the Croat guys and the Irish dudes and like the Polish guys. But it was always like, I was always very aware that, like, we're like down because we're white, but I'm part of like a very different culture. And like, my dad was this like poor Okie who ended up going to Harvard because the army sent him there. Like, my mom was like, the daughter of like this like Anglo-Ulster, like, old American dude who was literally born in 1898, and like this German lady who was like 50 years younger than him. And like, my folks, by today's standards, were like very right wing, like, not like I am, but they were like, they were like Taft Republican types. So it's like, it's not like I'm so smart that I'm not, or like I've got such great instincts, because I don't. But I always realized I'm like basically like mired in this kind of like weird culture I'm not a part of. And like, especially on the North Shore, it was like all Holocaust all the time, and like social studies. It was all these like weird like immigrant narratives and stuff. And it's like, of all the signals I picked up from like my family and the people I went to church with, it was like, we're not like part of that. And it's like, people weren't like openly saying like, yeah, fuck that shit. I mean, like, some of the guys I knew were, but like, my parents and their friends weren't like that. But it was obvious, like, that's got nothing to do with me, man. Like, why would I be into that shit? So it was like easy for me to kind of like find my way out, because I was never really like part of it, I guess. And plus, in Chicago, like, Chicago and Greater Chicagoland is like a weird fucking place. And like I'm always saying, it's like super segregated. Like, I'm always having to straighten people out who think like Chicago's super woke. I'm like, bro, like, people say like the N-word constantly, like unironically. Okay, like, nobody pretends to like each other. It's like, it's not like fucking Berkeley, but it's also like not like Manhattan or like Los Angeles, So like, but yeah, I not only are like young people the future, and people your age have like a dynamic energy that we need. But yeah, I realize that they were raised in profoundly screwed up circumstances that are not their fault.
Well, and I think part of it too, and
yeah,
I think there's a reason that we have, I would think, an overrepresentation in a far right movement of blue state Americans, right? Like, you're from Chicago. There's a lot of guys from from the UK, which is certainly
oh yeah,
incredibly paused. But in addition, just and there's kind of this group of them. They call themselves like blue state reactionaries, right? Because to a certain extent, growing up in a place where it is more on the nose, they have less of a need to kind of hide it and couch it. It's almost easier to see the contradictions in it. But as someone who's from a very conservative area, I've said before, I live where Jerry Falwell grew up, right? So that should tell you the kind of the area I'm in. But
yeah, it's almost more. That's why we're bros.
Yeah, exactly, right. And it's almost more difficult to see that kind of corruption, because even though the same premises that are currently being used, in kind of like the cutting edge, blue states, to push all of these policies that are, morally abhorrent, they're not really new premises. They're an expansion of the same, human rights, civil rights narrative that is present across the country. It's just
like
20 years behind the times. And so a lot of people get themselves tied up in knots. And it's why I've kind of, to me at least, it's the reason I spend so much time, quote unquote, attacking, kind of what I consider the good conservatives, right? The Buckleyite types, the people, the boomer conservatives, because they're good people in many cases. They have the right instincts, but they don't understand that they have adopted their enemies' framing to such a degree that they are trying to build a house on sand, right? They are being handed their building materials by the people who want to see them fail.
Yeah, that's very
so to
eloquently
me,
stated. Yeah.
That's why I actually think it's, in many ways, it is an advantage to have grown up, in a place like Chicago that, you're right, it's not Berkeley, but, the likelihood of Chicago flipping red, I mean, there's almost no chance of that, at this point,
No, exactly.
And I think that kind of like, it's a more honest version of what's going on than
I know what you. Yeah, I think Virginia is dope, and I mean I like the South. I've been the past like 2 years, like I've hit the South a bunch. Like Virginia, like Arkansas, friggin' Tennessee. But yeah, I know what you. I mean, I met some like hardcore like down ass woods who are like out and proud, who like like ride under the same shit that I do, and like that is fucking awesome. But yeah, a lot of the people I meet, they're like cool and they're like pro-white and stuff with qualifications, but they like freak out about the fact that they think I'm like this like crazy national socialist. And I mean, I guess I kind of am, but I don't like run from that. But yeah, it's because their thinking has been profoundly corrupted by social engineering of a far more subtle sort than one finds in in the enemy's backyard, as it were, or the enemy's like heartland, maybe. That's
that's completely true. It's more subtle, which almost makes it more difficult to examine.
I gotta raise up here in a minute, man. Like I don't mean to cut it short, but
no worries, man.
Yeah. I think this was a great conversation, man, and we should continue. If you want to do it, I mean, it's solely. I mean, it's not for me to like try and decide the course of your content topically, but I've been wanting to do something on like a history of liberalism. And its origins is in like Hobbesian ontology, and like Hobbes one of the greatest political theorists of all time, and so I mean, there's a peculiar irony there, and then Schmidt was like very conscious of that. But if you want to talk about, if you want to do like a dedicated pod episode, we can even go like a little longer than usual or something. Like beginning with Hobbes and like ending with Foucault or something.
Yeah, I'm extremely interested in that. We can work that out off air because that's something I'm definitely interested in.
Yeah. But thanks for hosting, man. I'm always very, very stoked when I receive your invitations to do so. And like I said, the feedback's been, other from some people who seem to like have a hobby of like just like hating me and like saying fucked up things like in my comment sections, like from serious people who aren't fucked up, like the legit feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and that owes to you and the way you organize our shit. Not because of anything I'm doing that's like spectacular. So yeah, I really appreciate it, man, and I really appreciate people. I really appreciate people for tuning in and supporting what you're doing. Not just like
I really enjoy it. So as we kind of wrap things up, where can people find you if they want to hear more of your work?
Well, I'm happy to report that on January 15th, my second science fiction novel is dropping through Imperium Press. That's imperiumpress.org is where I prefer people purchase it, because Bezos doesn't need more of your money. But you can find it on Amazon if you're located in a country where Imperium does not ship to. You can find me on Substack, where my podcast is posted up every 2 weeks. I'm probably gonna increase that to every once a week, but I haven't decided yet. But regardless, you can find my podcast and some of my long form there at realthomas777.substack.com. You can find me on Twitter at Triskelion Jihad, number 7, RISKELION JIHAD. And that's basically where I'm active these days. We've got a chat on the Substack. I got banned from freaking from Telegram, and I was a paying freaking subscriber there. And I had a channel with about 7,000 people, and we had a dope freaking chat, man. And those bastards shut it down. So I'm not gonna fuck with Telegram in any way, shape, or form anymore, man. Because like I said, I was a paying freaking customer, and it's ridiculous. But I'm not gonna play martyr. But that's where one can find me. By the end of January, I'm gonna launch at long last my YouTube channel. I don't do anything half-ass. I don't do anything until I'm confident I can produce quality content that's worthy of our cause and is worthy of subscribers. That's why it's been so long in coming. I finally feel comfortable with this YouTube medium now. I have an idea, and I have a concrete idea of how I want that to be structured. My editor, who's just a great guy, he's putting a lot of shine on what I'm sending his way. That by the last day in January, I promise it will launch. Forgive my long-windedness, but yes, that's where I can be found. And I can be found on Mr. Burden's pod when he's kind enough to host me, of course.
Yeah, no worries about that. As far as my stuff, obviously, all the links to my material as well as Thomas's will be in the YouTube description. The show will also premiere anywhere you listen to podcasts. You should notice that this video has a new thumbnail. We're kind of slowly rolling out the new look of the show. I've said before, I take this seriously and I want it to look good. So I've been investing back into, my content because you guys seem to like it. And, I want to put more effort into this. In addition to that, I've also changed up my monetization. Whereas before I was, gating my backlog behind a paywall. Now it's always up there. I decided that was too much work. It wasn't really enough utility to justify it. But if you still do want to pay to support the show, which I really appreciate, there's a series of different ways you can find me on, Patreon, Subscribestar, buy me a coffee, or just use the paid feature on my Substack. And all of those are good ways to support the show. And again, thank you so much for coming out, Thomas.
Thank you, my friend.
And guys, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.